Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another installment of the NTC podcast. We are back with episode 86, brought to you by Sports Business Classroom. I'm Aaron Washington. Colin Maher is on my right. We are glad to be back with you guys for another episode. It's been quite a while, Colin, since you've been on the pod. So glad to have your expertise back in the mix. The NBA season's off to a great start. So, as always, man, it's going to be a great time. Good to have you back in the mix.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back on the pod. It's definitely been a while, and happy to jump on and talk some basketball again and get nerdy about the salary cap yet again.
Man, we are going to get nerdy big time on this one because we just had a huge trade take place just yesterday in the wee hours in the morning. Actually, most people were woken up by this news. I was one of them. You have the blurry eyes. You're waking up. You're staring at your phone, and you see the trade details. And you're like, is this real? Did this really happen? So we really got thrown a curveball on this one. But in any case, we wanted to dive into the specifics of this deal because it is really interesting. And this trade means quite a bit for both teams, both in the short term and the long term, in which we'll get to a little bit later as far as the limitations that will come up starting next season. For now, we do have the full pick details. The trade became official today. So we're going to dive into this trade from both sides. We're going to get into first the Clippers side, followed by the Sixers, just to kind of keep things organized so you know where we're going with this. Make sure you're following us. But to give a brief overview of the deal, these are the terms. So the Sixers agreed to send Harden, PJ Tucker, and Filip Petrusev. Apologize if I'm butchering that name, but I'll give it my best shot. To the LA Clippers. So in return for expiring contracts. Now, that's one key part of this deal that's very important to keep in mind. The contracts of KJ Martin, Nicholas Batum, Covington, and Marcus Morris. And there are some picks that were also moved in this deal. They include a 2028 unprotected Clippers pick, Clippers first, a 2026 first that comes from the Thunder. We can talk about that here in a little bit as far as like why that had to be included. And followed by second round picks in 2024 and 2029. Those are also a part of this deal here, Colin. Wanted to point this out here before I get into the pick situation. The contracts of all these players, so Covington, Batum, KJ Martin, Marcus Morris, wanted to point that out that they cannot be aggregated in another trade until January 1st. So that was also reported. So I wanted to point that out. So these teams can't just bundle them together right now and immediately ship them off in another deal. Like in the Sixers situation, all these expiring contracts, they have to wait until the beginning of next year to do that. Now,
and the rule is it's a 2-month rule. It doesn't happen. It just so happens to land on January 1st. Just for clarity for those who like to know what the specific rule is, it's when you acquire someone using a salary cap exception, you can't aggregate them in another trade for 2 months from the date you acquire them. There's some exceptions to those exceptions, but that's generally what it is.
Of course. That's how the NBA works. It's like nothing is as concrete as it looks. There's always some kind of loophole.
Always.
Yep. So now getting into the pick situation, I did mention that there was a 2024 second included in this deal. Now, this is not an unprotected second coming straight from I believe it's the Sixers situation or the Clippers situation. Because if you go to their pick situation on our website, they don't have their own second to offer in a trade. So their only two options were a Toronto second round pick and then another second round pick that was it was weird. So it was a blend between Indiana, Cleveland, and Utah second round pick. So it was the more favorable of Indiana, followed by the least favorable of Cleveland and Utah. So they're going to be like right in the middle of all these teams as far as what pick they got. That got shipped over to the Sixers. So now the Sixers have that pick. They got bundled into that mix. So now it's 4 teams. So I don't have the full details of who gets what order, but it's basically the Pacers, the Cavs, the Jazz, and the Sixers are all bundled together, and they're going to get some kind of order of picks, second round picks next year. So the details of that, I don't have those yet, trying to get those. But in any case, those 4 teams are all bundled together. So it's not as cut and dry as just a 2024 second because the Clippers didn't have one of their own to offer. Now they're that 2026 first. I want to get into that a little bit here. So it's going to be the least valuable of the Clippers first, the Thunder first, and the Rockets first. In addition, there is a protection attached to it. So it's Houston's pick is top 4 protected. So if it does end up being a situation where it's a top 4 pick, the Rockets are going to maintain that pick regardless. But if it doesn't, it's just straight up the least valuable of the 3 teams' picks. Then moving on to the first rounder, that is a 2029 first round pick. This is a top 3 protected for the Clippers. So there is a protection attached to it. It's not a straight up unprotected. Wanted to point that out as well. The Clippers do maintain a little bit of protection there for that pick. So 2029 is also involved in that. So if you go on our draft capital page on our website, you will see that the Clippers now have no picks in 26 and 28, none at all, no first, no seconds. Of course, due to the Stepien rule, they have to have at least one first in every other year. They can't go 2 straight years with no first round picks. So as a result, they still have first round picks in 25, 27, 29, and 30. However, the 2025 and 7 are swaps. So those are going to be the least favorable between the Clippers and Thunder first round pick. 2029 also has a little bit of a funky thing going on with it. So Philly is going to have the right to swap first with the Clippers, but it's still protected 1 through 3, top 3 protected. So I wanted to point those out as well because, there's a lot of funky things going on with those picks, but that's the situation. That's where these teams stand right now. So wanted to point that out here real quick. Colin, to throw this over to you, getting into the tax bill situation, the Clippers tax bill did increase by about $29 million. So it's up to about 128 now. Philadelphia situation, their tax bill decreases from 19 to 13. So now the Sixers are just a little bit above the luxury tax, according to what Bobby Marks posted just recently. So looking at this whole situation, starting from the Clippers side, getting into the finances here, getting into salary cap situation, what are we looking at as far as what the Clippers are dealing with now with their pick situation, what they have available to them, what they use to make this deal happen? Give us the breakdown of that situation.
Yeah. So as far as the Clippers, and by the way, great job with those picks. I mean, it's unbelievable
It's a lot,
what
man.
we have to deal with as far as the pick contingencies and the protections. But as far as what we're dealing with the Clippers, I mean, if you didn't think they were all in before, they're all in now. It's like both teams are on completely different pathways. It's like talk about 2 ends of the spectrum, right? You have Daryl Morey and the Sixers, who are literally clearing house for next year and making sure that they have amazing freedom with the salary cap, while the Clippers say, "Hey, we have Kawhi and Paul George, and we're just going to go all in and see if we can get this done while we can." So, like you said, their cupboard is bare when it comes to the draft capital. They're over the cap now, the second apron. So you're talking about the tax bill. Just to break it down a little bit more for people, when he talks about talk about the tax bill, we're talking about, the tax rate is going to be exponentially greater than how much more over you are the tax level. So the Clippers, they went from around $11.3 million over the second apron. Now they're about $16.7 million over the second apron as it stands right now. The 76ers, they were over the first apron. Now with this deal, they go under the first apron. So they're around 2.7 million, or excuse me, 2.3 million over. Now they're $2.7 million under the first apron. Those are different than the tax bill. The tax bill is just the tax level. The aprons are going to deal with your roster building limitations in the future. And we can dive into those too. We'll dive into those first as to how both teams were able to execute this deal, being Clippers being a second apron team in this season, and how that's going to be very different next season if they're still a second apron team, and the 76ers essentially using the same type of exception, but diving under the first apron to do so, and being able to gain a trade exception when doing so. So you let me know how you want to go about diving through the deal and the inner workings of exactly how the trade comes about and how all these salaries work, trading salary to salary, and what exceptions get used.
Sure. So want to point this out, before getting into the exceptions and everything. You mentioned that next year this same deal will not be possible because of the whole second apron rules. So that plays a part because of the cash involved in this deal. So the Clippers sent out cash in this deal to make this all work. Now, a team over the second apron can do that this season. That is allowed. Next season, 2024, second apron teams will not be able to send cash in a deal. So even though the cash looks very insignificant, it was $3 million total from the Clippers. They sent $2 million to the Sixers and $1 million to the Thunder. Even that small amount of money, relatively speaking, in the grand scheme of things, would not be possible whatsoever to make this happen. Now, do want to point out as well that the Thunder are involved in this deal because they sent cash to the Thunder. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Thunder did send out a pick to make this all kind of work together. So they sent over a 2026 first to the Sixers to make this work. So wanted to bring up first the annual cash limit, since that's something that most people don't think about. Last season, the cash limit was about $6.3 million. I don't have the amount for this season. I imagine it's maybe a few $100,000 more than last season. So let's just say 6.5. They used up about half of that in this deal. So, for the Clippers, the rest of this season, they can't send out more than $3 million, $3.5 million the rest of the way because of the annual cash limit. So the cash is very important to touch on. And then, Colin, we've got to remember, too, that when you have multiple teams in a deal, it's not just two teams. The teams have to interact together. So it's called touching each other. So if there's three teams, you can't just deal with one team and have any kind of contact with the other team. They all have to work together in some form or fashion. So the Clippers didn't send out that $1 million. That qualifies. It has to be at least $1.1 million cash to qualify as a touch, the two teams having some kind of interaction. So that 1.1 million did qualify, and then we had the pick go out in the deal as well from the OKC side. So it makes it all kind of work together. When three teams are involved, they all have to have some kind of communication together on that front. So I did want to point that out as well. So now we can get into the exceptions involved in here, at least from the Clipper side starting off here. So, Colin, if you want to touch on that a little bit as far as the exception used and how that all kind of came about, the trade exception that did come up as a result of this deal. So what's that looking like?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially both teams in some form or fashion used a trade exception called the transition traded players exception. This one is where you're able to use you need 110% of the outgoing salary for the incoming salary, plus $250,000 kicker if you're not over the first apron. So essentially what happened was for the Clippers, they sent out around almost $42.5 million, and that got them literally to within about $50,000 for Harden. Just got it. And he had to waive his trade bonus to get there. He had about a $5 million trade bonus, which I find hilarious when you're demanding to be traded that you still have to waive your trade bonus. But anyway, so that's essentially what they used to get it done. It's all four of their players for essentially for the two players coming back. That's how they're able to get it done. Now, it's called the transition traded players exception because it's transitioning from the old CBA to the new CBA, and it's going from 110% to 100%. So essentially what's going to happen is it's not going to exist anymore after this year. And second, another rule that's going to be eliminated for second apron teams. One, you're not going to be able, no one's going to have the transition traded players exception. And two, they're not going to be able to aggregate contracts anymore to send out anymore. So this deal wouldn't even come close to be getting done anymore.
Right.
And then, like you said, on top of that, they wouldn't be sending cash out anymore either. So these are just some major things that you got to think about moving into these future seasons if you're thinking about being a second apron team. And that's why these deals are going to get done now, right? And they're
Exactly.
so essentially what happened on the Philly side, they did the same thing, but that was only to gain we call it a trade exception, but it's a little bit different. So essentially what they did now, of course, they had less money coming in, more money going out. So you want to get creative when you're doing that to be able to essentially create as much flexibility moving forward as you can. And if you send more money going out, you might be able to create a different type of trade exception for the future that you can use if you're over the salary cap in a separate trade. And that's exactly what they did. And I won't go salary by salary, but essentially what they were able to do, they had two choices here. They could have used the expanded traded players exception, which is it's 125% of your outgoing salary for the incoming salary. They would have been able to get a much greater trade exception for the future. They would have been able to get all of PJ Tucker's salary, the $11 million. So essentially what would happen is they would get that, and for basically a year, they would have that $11 million. They could go find a player for $11 million and some change. Instead of doing that, what they did is they elected to go similar to the Clippers and use the transition traded player exception, the 110%. Because what would happen if they did the expanded traded player exception is they would be hard capped, which means they wouldn't be able to go over that first apron that we were just talking about. So when we're talking about in 2 months, they're able to bundle up these players again and go out and try to get another player, Pascal Siakam, someone else that a big star player to go along with Embiid and Maxey. They wouldn't be able to go over that second apron, or I'm sorry, that first apron. They're only $2 million under it, right? So if they want that flexibility. So what they did is they elected to use the transition traded players exception, the 110% instead, and they created about a $6.8 million trade exception instead. They also created a smaller one on top of that. And then they're able to get it done that way. So I'm going to write about this as well. I'll diagram out each salary for salary, the math and how it all worked out. It's a lot harder to explain without visuals.
Right.
But essentially they're both able to use this transition traded players exception, which essentially isn't going to exist anymore in the future. Right. And that's the interesting part. The other thing that's really interesting about this is the transition traded players exception also hard caps you in future seasons if you used it after the regular season. So the fact that they use it during the season instead of after the regular season, again, is another thing that won't exist in the future. So these are all things to think about as we move towards these limitations, because if the Sixers wanted to create that trade exception in the future, they would be a hard cap for the rest of the year. So another thing to think about on the Philly side of things.
Yeah, it is really important to point that out, Colin, because teams want as much flexibility as they can get, because you never know how your situation is going to change as a team as you progress through the season. What stands today for the Sixers or any other team in the league may not be the case tomorrow. So you might want to bring back more salary. You want more tools at your disposal. So now by doing this, only going into the 110%, it really gives them that opportunity to do that. Couple other little details here on the Clippers side here before we really dive into the Sixers. As you mentioned before, the deal barely worked. It was 50 grand or less as far as the margins go. The Clippers did have to include KJ Martin in a small salary to make this work. KJ's not making a whole ton of money, just a few million here, but he did have to be included. He's a good young player that the Clippers had, but they had to send him out. order to make the numbers work. So that's interesting to note. And then as far as the Clippers situation right now on their cap sheet, there are two really important, I guess three really important, um, possibly three expiring salaries. So you look at Paul George at 45, you look at Kawhi at 45 million. They have player options for next season. They're currently eligible to sign an extension. It has not happened yet. So that has not happened. So they could be free agents next year. We'll have to see if they want to wait and then do it in the offseason or they want to do it now. PJ Tucker has a player option for next season. You know, it's probably a lot more likely that he picks his up rather than the other two. The other two really seem like a 50-50 chance right now. James Harden is also he's an expiring salary. So that's their top three guys that compose this team, they're part of this team. They can all become free agents next year. So we'll have to kind of monitor that situation and see if they all kind of want to go in together as a whole next summer and sign a new deal together. That could make a lot of sense. With Paul and Kawhi, I mean, they have a lot of security. Then there's full bird rights here. There's not a lot of risk in waiting until the summertime. So I wouldn't be surprised if they do wait, see how the season goes with James Harden, reevaluate come July, and then kind of figure out where they want to go from there. So those three guys, your top three guys, are going to possibly be free agents at the same time. It's, I wouldn't be super concerned if I were the Clippers, but it's just something to keep in mind. If you have three of your best players going out in the open market at the same time, you never know what could happen. So also wanted to point that out here while we're talking about the Clippers, since, there's already so much pressure that the team is under for this season. That just kind of makes it even more. It brings it one step further. So we haven't really talked a lot about the on-court product here in this trade so far, but I mean, there's a lot of moving parts here. There's a lot of guys that are going to have to change their roles. Westbrook's going to have to change his role a little bit. Harden's going to have to change his role the most, going from more of an on-ball to an off-ball situation. Paul and Kawhi less so. I think they've already gotten accustomed to kind of playing with one another, playing a little bit more away from the basketball. Terrence Mann is going to have to adjust his role again. He was slotted to be the starter. We'll see if that's the case once he returns from injury. But I mean, there's still a good amount of players in this team outside of that big three to kind of make this whole thing go. And it's going to be an adjustment period. I really think they're going to need some time to kind of coalesce here. And there's not a lot of time. There's really not a lot of time. The postseason comes up in the blink of an eye. And like I said before, free agency is not far behind that if those two big guys do not extend right now. So that's the situation on the court. It's a lot going on, man.
And on top of that, I mean, you got to think about health, right? And whether these guys are going to be on the court, whether they can stay healthy in the playoffs is a whole different question. But forget about that. You got to stay healthy during the regular season to figure out, what the lineup in the rotation is going to look like. Is Westbrook going to come off the bench? Is he going to run a second unit, or is he going to, are these four guys essentially going to operate together? It's going to be interesting to see how they're all, because when you say that, Paul and Kawhi have gotten used to taking lesser roles with each other. Well, now they have to take an even lesser role with Harden coming on board, right? So I don't know how it'll all work out together. I don't know if it will work out together in such a strong Western Conference, but they had to do. They're all in, like you said, with all of these guys coming up on contracts, and that's the bigger issue for the Clippers after this year is their cupboard's bare as far as draft capital. They're not going to be able to trade these guys and get picks back and start the rebuilding process. So then it's, I would assume that Paul and Kawhi are going to opt out to sign one more longer term deal. And when they do that, so then you're locking these guys, and same with Harden, he's going to want a long-term deal. So now you're having three guys on multi-year contracts who are already on the back end of their careers. So this season is going to be very, very pivotal, even if they don't go deep in the playoffs, just to see what they look like from a health standpoint, from a chemistry standpoint. And just like every other team does now, you sign these guys up and you figure it out later. You just hope it's not a negative value contract that you can unload if you need to in the future.
Right. You mentioned their collective. You mentioned the age of these guys. Their best players are all over the age of 30. Just real briefly, they now have the highest. This was pre-trade, but they had the highest average roster age in the league at 30.6 years old. Many of the great teams over the past 20 or so years, 30 years, have also been pretty old. The 2013 Heat, 30.3. The 07 Spurs, 30.4. The 97 Bulls, 30.7. The 2011 Mavericks, 30.9, almost 31. And then the 98 Bulls, 31.7. Third
Well,
oldest
you're
ever.
other than the Mavericks, though, you're talking about teams that were all at the end of their dynasties.
That's true.
You know,
But they
you're
still
not
won.
talking about teams being put together to see if it all works.
Right.
You know, and on the other side of that, think about the Lakers who were put together with Karl Malone and Steve Nash and those guys, and it just didn't work. Right? It was a disaster. You know, that's more of what I'm not calling this a disaster. I think that these guys are all talented players and could make it work, but I don't consider this, a Spurs, the end of the Spurs or the Bulls or teams like that, where of course they're older and successful. They've been doing it for years before that,
Right. Just wanted to point that out because, it's not a death sentence that they have an old team.
No, certainly not. If they can figure it out, I mean, that's the thing. And the Heat did it with LeBron and Wade. It took them, they got to the finals, but it took them a year to win it, right?
Yeah.
So you never know.
You never know. I mean, I'm skeptical, but maybe things break right for them. They're due for some good luck.
That's right.
So we'll be keeping an eye on them.
And that's the thing, though. Even LeBron and those guys, none of those guys, or you think about the Mavs or the Spurs, from what I can remember, none of those guys were injury prone.
Yeah.
These guys are all injury prone. Paul and Kawhi are injury prone. And even Harden's had his issues now and even conditioning issues. So that's the even bigger concern as they get older is those, can they stay on the court?
Exactly. Now, there's a team here that got a little bit younger that we're looking at here. Well, maybe if you look at all the guys they got back in this trade, maybe not so young. But now looking at the Philly situation, looking at the other side of things. So they are the ones that sent out James Harden. They finally got the drama out from under themselves. Got back some good, solid players, expiring contracts. So going back again to that point of flexibility, the Sixers maintain a lot of flexibility for next season. They have a lot to work with here. So if we're looking out to next season and beyond, they now project to have, I believe, 62 or so million in cap room. The only guaranteed money being Embiid's 51, and then a cap hold for Maxey. And of course, they're going to have to re-up Maxey and give him a new contract since he's a restricted free agent next summer. But they have a lot of options here as far as what they want to do with the roster. Now, as far as the roster itself right now, they did have to cut Danny Green to make this all work. They sent out a certain number of players to make this work. So I believe they sent out 4, and they sent out 3. They got back 4. So they had a +1. They had to cut 1 to get under the roster limit rule. So I wanted to point that out as well. They got that. They got that trade exception. They used 110, as you mentioned before, to kind of make this all work and give themselves more flexibility, not being hard capped at the first apron. What's interesting here is that we did mention that they were just under that first apron. They're not too far over the tax itself. If they do want to get under the tax, they have an avenue to do that. Furkan Korkmaz has an expiring deal. It's worth a little over $5 million. If they want to trade that away, they can and then sign a minimum contract. This is according to John Hollinger's article in The Athletic I read today. They can get just barely under the tax. Like we're talking about maybe even less money than that $50,000 we talked about before, just barely under the luxury tax, which, for this situation may make a lot of sense to do that. Korkmaz is not in the rotation right now. I believe he's not getting a lot of minutes. He's not really a big part of that team right now. So if they can find somebody else at the minimum to kind of approximate the role he has, that could be something they explore. So don't be surprised if they do try to move off of him at some point. But, look at the Sixers situation here. I mean, they shed a lot of money. Their tax bills drastically reduced, as we mentioned before. And this is Maxi's team now. That's the big development of all this. Moving off of Harden, Maxi takes his place. He's a full-time starter. He has star upside. And, I mean, this team has been playing very well to start the season. I want to quickly point out that they're playing a different style now. I've read about this a little bit here in the few games they've played. New style under Nick Nurse. It's less stagnant. There's more ball movement. There's more player movement. There's different actions to get Embiid open, to take advantage of the Embiid Maxi dynamic and pick and rolls. So everybody is more fluid. Everybody's moving around more, a little bit harder to guard. And I mean, I still think they're going to be a great basketball team. I would be surprised if they finish anywhere below the 5th seed, honestly, after this trade, just because of still having Embiid, still having Maxi, Tobias Harris, D'Anthony Melton, and then these guys they brought in. I mean, Covington used to play for the Sixers in his early days. Now he's back for another tour. So Kelly Oubre off the bench, a lot of great players here. So I know I kind of skipped ahead a little bit over some of the financials here, but I just wanted to mention that I am still excited to see this team now that there's less drama, no Simmons, no Harden, no holding out, no fines, no suspensions. It's all over with. So that now they can just focus on playing basketball, doing business the right way, and just having a great season. So what do you see from this team on your side of things?
Yeah, going back to the financial part again, that will be interesting to see because it essentially will say that I don't know if it'll say that they're giving up on the season, but it will say that they're giving up on the season from a roster building standpoint, unless they do it. And then, if something opens up down the line, then who cares? Then you go over the tax at that point. But the other part too, is you get under the tax, you're not only saving on the tax, but then you get to revenue. You enter the revenue share too, right? So Joe Harris might be looking at that and saying, hey, if we can make this one tweak, let's do that. And then we'll go all in, in the upcoming years. Unless something, again, opens up, if Siakam becomes available or someone like that. But
right.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the biggest things that they did was they got rid of the drama that year after year they seem to have for whatever reason. And, people who are criticizing this deal, my question is, well, what do you want them to do at this point? Look, maybe Daryl Morey made a mistake at some point. Maybe ownership did. Who's to say? But at this point, where it stood, what else did you want them to do? You were able to clear out Harden, get some assets for him, and you like you said, they still have a very competitive team. I think that they have a puncher's chance in the East. Unfortunately for them, you have two heavyweights at the top, and you still have a lot of talent there with Cleveland and New York as well. But they're set for the future with when they re-up Maxi. They have one of the top 5 players in the world, and they have all that space where they can either, acquire someone via trade during the season, in the off season, or look in free agency. I don't know what's going to be out there anymore. That's just not how guys get acquired anymore. But they got a couple more draft picks that they can send out if they need to do it via trade. So I think that they're sitting in a good spot considering where they were last week, when you just didn't know what was going to happen with Harden. It felt awkward even like seeing him on the bench after you hear that he was denied getting on the plane. I mean, it really sounds fake. If you saw that in a show, you would just think that it's too fake. But man, the NBA, that's just how it goes. So they're able in a market where it was one team, you're still able to land a couple decent draft picks and get some good role players that hopefully can contribute to the team. But more importantly, you're cleared up for next year, which is the important part. And I think that's what they know. I think that's what really matters to Daryl.
Exactly. And speaking of next year, I mean, they have a first and a second available to them in their draft arsenal. So they have their own first next year. They have a New York second, and then they have that whole jumbled up Indiana/Cavs/Jazz second as well. So, I mean, they have picks to trade. They have expirings. They're going to have cap space next year. I mean, there's a lot of avenues to improve even more than they already are right now, as far as like how good of a basketball team they are. So, I mean, looking forward over the next several years with their draft capital situation, I mean, they have several picks. Now they are tied up in protections between OKC and Brooklyn because of, of course, they did that big trade with Brooklyn a couple years ago. So there is some stuff tied up with that as far as like having a first in 27 and 28, top 8 protected, top 6, 2025 to the Thunder, top 4 protected.
But even that 28 Clippers pick, that one's going to be the most valuable one right now because as we were talking about, that's an aging team. You can't really think that they're going to be, on track to be a great team in 2028. I mean, who's to say in the NBA? But as far as value is concerned, when you're looking at draft capital, you got to think that that's a valuable pick that they might be able to include in a deal. It's unprotected.
Super valuable.
Yeah,
super valuable. Because, I mean, we're talking about 5 years from now. So, I mean, all these guys are in their late 30s. So, I mean, at that point, if they're even still in the league, I mean, they're drastically worse players than they are right now.
Right.
So you think about the Clippers situation, and we just talked about how they have very little capital of their own, draft capital. So it's not like they're going to be able to quickly pivot unless they really just kind of act quickly before these guys really drop off and get that back somehow. But as things stand, they don't look good for the future. Starting probably in 26, going forward from there. Those first definitely hold more value for whoever has them. So yeah, for the Sixers, I mean, they do have several picks. They're only unprotected first or next year in 2030. But even with that being said, they have that Clippers first in 28 to offer. They have multiple seconds. I mean, 2029, they have 3 seconds that they can offer for teams. And if you look at these trades in recent history, there's a lot of seconds being moved. Seconds are not worth the same today as they were 5 years ago. It's a totally different situation. So those can actually bring you a decent player back if you're really looking to upgrade your team. So, yeah, I mean, from all angles, you look at what the Sixers have done here. They really traded out a 0 on their team. I mean, Harden had no interest in being there. He was completely disengaged. He was disinterested. He was a ticking time bomb. So, I mean, he either plays and your team is disjointed, he's not really vibing with the team, or he doesn't play and there's fines attached, and it's just a lot of bad press on that team. The locker room is not in a good spot. So it's really addition by subtraction. I know they got players in return, but even though they shipped out an All-NBA player not too long ago, and a guy that still plays at an All-Star level, you're really just shipping out a guy that wasn't giving you hardly anything in return. And then you give yourself so many avenues to improve even after this deal that it just makes so much sense to not do this deal. So I really do also like the fact that OKC first kind of worked into the mix to kind of make it happen, because Daryl Morey, he was insisting on that second first rounder, and the Clippers just weren't vibing with that, and they weren't able to make that happen. So really great work all around from all parties to make this work, make kind of everything connect together. And I mean, the Sixers are going to be a lot better off for this. Maybe not this season, but down the road.
And on top of all that, like you were talking about, Maxey looks like a great player. And I think that the trade is addition by subtraction for him too, where it's going to accelerate his development as a player.
100%.
And this year is going to be a huge year for him from a growth standpoint. It already looks like, I mean, he's there, but it's going to be massive for him to be able to play in Nurse's system without Harden taking up a lot of those shots for Maxey.
Oh yeah, I mean, having Harden there, the Harden and Embiid pairing was great. There's no doubting that their pick and roll game was pretty great.
Yeah.
But it's just something different about having Maxey there. He's not going to pound the ball for 15 seconds of the shot clock. One of the fastest players in the league, super explosive. He has a great 3-pointer as well. starting in his second year, I mean, he just trended way up, and now he's a 40+% 3-point shooter from deep as well.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm with you. I love what this is going to mean for his development, the way he's going to really just, I guess, just find another gear with this team. And yeah, I mean, honestly, for them this season, they have a lot of great players. They did a lot of great things here, and hopefully, this is the last of their troubles as far as drama goes. I mean, they just had a really awful 3 or 4 year stretch. They haven't been able to get out of the second round. They've had multiple players ask out, quit on the team. So I mean, they've been hit from all angles. So I mean, it's really great that they were able to kind of soft restart, fresh start, get things back where they need to be, and just got to see what you have as far as the future goes. They have some young talents, Maxey, B-ball, Paul Reed, love his game. Kelly Oubre is still a relatively young player. Jaden Springer as well. I mean, Jaden Springer has been kind of a mini revelation for them. Coming in, bringing his defense, another kind of spark off the bench. So it's not like they have this team that's like the Clippers, to where they had the oldest team in the league. They still have some relatively young guys with some upside that they can tap into. So great stuff all around for the Sixers. It makes sense for both teams. Just looking at zooming out again for this trade, both teams really need. I wouldn't say the Clippers need to make this deal. I mean, this is really like a, why not add another former All-NBA guy to our team, see what happens. But I get it from both sides. There's a lot more risk on the Clippers side. I think that much is evident.
Yeah. I certainly get it. It's one of those things where if you're a Clippers fan, I'd be thinking, at some point, can we just get someone younger in here to help change the timeline of at least some of the top players on the team? But I see where they're coming from putting all your eggs in the basket and seeing where everything lands here in the Western Conference.
Things change quick, so
yep.
When you have an opportunity, it just makes sense to kind of take advantage of it. If it doesn't work, hey, at least you tried. You at least got to show some effort, give your team the best chance to win. So you can't fault them for that.
Right. Yep.
So, Colin, I think we about hit all the points of this deal. Great insight as always. Great conversation. I hope that the listeners, the watchers here, gained a little bit more knowledge about what made this specific deal possible, as well as what this is going to mean for the future of the NBA, for the future of these two teams, and what we're going to see going forward. So if you guys are looking for our cap sheets, you're looking for our draft capital page, notradeclause.com. If you're watching it, it's on the screen right below our screens here. You can check that out. We have all the resources for you, and we will drop a post on our socials when Colin does come out with that article, diving into these numbers here a little bit more from financial perspective. So, Colin, thanks again, man. Glad to have you back on the pod. Hope everything is well.
Happy to be back, man. It's been too long. That was great.
Yes, sir. Good stuff. Everybody, thanks for checking out another episode. We'll be back next week with another installment. Until then, enjoy these great games. Hopefully we get more thrillers like the Spurs-Suns game last night. More 20-point meltdowns. I'm sure there will be more. Have a great time. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you on the next podcast.